Science fiction takes me back in time, sometimes literally. The genre was my first literary love. I remember spending countless hours reading Analog and Asimov's robot stories. I was always more into short stories than novels, but I devoured the classics, of course. Childhood's End, The Man in the High Castle, 1984, Ender's Game. Oh, and how I loved A Wrinkle in Time when I was in third grade. And yes, I had a crush on Meg Murray. I wonder what she's up to now. Like any genre, science fiction offers a diverse range of stories. Slipstream, alternate history, hard SF, cyberpunk, steampunk. There's more than 100 years of stories in which a reader can immerse him or herself. Each genre, subgenre, and sub-subgenre have their own conventions, but no matter what you are writing, every choice a writer makes should be done in service of the story he or she is trying to tell. That brings me to Robert Kroese. First of all, I have to mention that this guy knocks it out of the park with the indie game. He's a zillion times better than I am at marketing, releasing books on a regular basis, all of those non-craft facets of this modern endeavor. The business of self-publishing, unfortunately, is not my forte. That's how nerds pronounce that word. But in all modesty, I have plenty of good stuff to say about writing craft. The Legacy of the Iron Dragon continues Kroese's Iron Dragon series. Let's take a look at the book description. The war against the implacable Chota'an carried a desperate group of humans 1,300 years into the past, but the fight for humanity's future is just beginning. Mankind's future among the stars now rests on a ragtag band of Vikings who have taken to the stars. The Norsemen's only hope is to ally with the mysterious people called Truskins, who possess the technology to defeat the aliens. But where did the Truskins come from? What do they want? Can they be trusted as allies against the Chota'an? The Legacy of the Iron Dragon continues the story began in the Dragon Award nominated The Dream of the Iron Dragon, in a sweeping saga that carries us from war-ravaged planets in the 23rd century to 1st century Judea, where the fate of the Roman Empire is being decided. The Legacy of the Iron Dragon is an epic mashup of military sci-fi, time travel, and alternate history. I'm sure you can see why I'm going to talk about genre in this writing craft video. We'll take a look at Mr. Kroese's work and consider it in the context of other science fiction writers. How about Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury? But first, a word from our sponsor. Having trouble thinking up a story? Try What If. When you use What If, you can use the ideas already swirling around in your head to get the idea for the story and work backwards from there. For example, I've just been revisiting the story of the Unabomber. If you recall, Ted Kaczynski was finally identified and arrested because his brother David recognized Ted's voice in the Unabomber's manifesto. So, what if your protagonist finds out that his sibling, who lives on a small base on a remote planet, is responsible for hacking into and sabotaging the life support systems of a competing colony? What should the protagonist do? Rat out the brother? Or try to solve the problem in another way? What if there's a complication? What if the sabotaging sibling has a big secret that, if revealed, could cause big problems for that sibling? See, we've got a story cooking. That's a freebie from the good people at What If. What If? Use the promo code Allison, that's ALLISON, for 20% off your next order. You'll be dreaming up stories in no time. As I pointed out, The Legacy of the Iron Dragon incorporates several different genres. There's some historical fiction, time travel, space opera, military SF, all whipped up together. And for us self-publishing folk, let's take a look at the Amazon categories just for fun. Okay, we got Greek and Roman myth and legend, Norse and Viking myth and legend, Greco-Roman myth and legend, fantasy, ebooks. Interesting, huh? Those are all appropriate to the book, but The Legacy of the Iron Dragon is somewhat difficult to categorize. That's not a problem, but many of those who dispense indie publishing advice would have plenty to say. But that's not why we're here. One of the things that struck me about the book is that the prose fits the genre, and Mr. Kroese's clear intention for the book. Mr. Kroese wants to tell a rip-roaring SF yarn with lots of action. Groovy. What's the first law of storytelling? The choices we make must serve our story. You can repeat it like a mantra. Let's take a look at the very beginning of the first chapter. Yes, I know the book has a prologue. Geneva Orbital Defense Command, 2227 AD, Earth Reckoning. Admiral Cole Huyskamp was in his quarters when a warning klaxon informed him of a problem. A glance at his wristcom confirmed his worst suspicions. A group of unknown ships had just materialized in the Geneva system, less than 500 million clicks from Geneva herself. This was the moment he had feared since taking command of the Geneva system's defense 18 months earlier. He set aside the speech he'd been preparing, an inspiring exhortation intended for the colonists who would shortly be boarding the 3 seed ships bound for the uncharted parts of the galaxy, and hurried to the command deck. The reader gets exactly what he or she expects from a work in this genre. Immediate exposition. There's no delay at all. We know the year, we learn about a couple of the protagonist's big obstacles. Military time. We learn that Mr. Kroese's story is much more Starship Troopers than Steven Spielberg's AI artificial intelligence. The characters are military personnel on ships. Those ships have cool science fiction weapons. Those ships are guarding space, just like military ships defended territory in the ocean during World War II. Look at the word choices, too. If a reader is looking for a story that is a little more The Best of Both Worlds Part 2 and a little less family, then this book will scratch that itch. It's Admiral, not just coal. Klaxon, clicks, seed ships, command deck. In the opening of the novel, we don't get a close look into the good Admiral's heart and soul, and that's okay, because the author is making far different promises to the reader. All right, it's time for compare and contrast, just like in 7th grade English class. As you might expect, I'm surrounded by zero friends or family. I am, however, surrounded by books. Oh, hey, look what I have here. A 1960s vintage copy of Isaac Asimov's The Rest of the Robots. I know what you're wondering. It smells wonderful, like an early Worldcon. If this were a real YouTube video or podcast, I'd need to include another ad read at this point. So here we go. What if? The all-time greats have used it. Why shouldn't you? In the first volume of his million-word memoir, Asimov gave a strong endorsement to What If. My notion was to have a robot refuse to believe he had been created mechanically in a factory, but to insist that men were only his servants and that robots were the peak of creation, having been created by some godlike entity. What's more, he would prove his case by reason, and reason was the title of the story. Asking one question, that's all it took. About another story, Asimov said, this time I wanted to write a story about a robot that, through some mistake on the assembly line, turned out to be capable of reading minds. And he didn't stop there. He and highly influential editor John Campbell thought about what should happen after the What If. Again, Campbell became interested, and we talked it over at length. What complications would arise out of robotic telepathy, what a robot would be forced to lie about, how the matter could be resolved, and so on. Try What If. You won't regret it. Okay, we're back. Like I said, I picked up an old copy of an Asimov anthology. I already pointed out how the beginning of The Legacy of the Iron Dragon fits the genre and tone of the novel. Let's see how Asimov fares. Here's the opening of Robot AL-76 Goes Astray. Jonathan Quell's eyes crinkled worriedly behind their rimless glasses as he charged through the door labeled General Manager. He slapped the folded paper in his hands upon the desk and panted, "Look at that, boss!" Sam Tobe juggled the cigar in his mouth from one cheek to the other and looked. His hand went to his unshaven jaw and rasped along it. "Hell!" he exploded. "What are they talking about?" "They say we sent out 5 AL robots," Quell explained, quite unnecessarily. "We sent 6, said Tobe. "Sure, 6, but they only got 5 at the other end. They sent out the serial numbers and AL-76 is missing." Boom! In a quarter of a page, we have the point of the story. What happened to the robot? Why? What further complications can we expect? I forget the adjective that Asimov used to describe his own prose, but I don't think he'd chafe at workmanlike. This story is going to be about the idea, about the what if, not a highbrow literary journey. And that's okay. What about The Veldt by the great Ray Bradbury? Computer. Oh, I'm going to have way too much fun with this page of Star Trek sounds that I found. Computer. Please bring up the opening of Ray Bradbury's The Veldt.
Affirmative.
Isn't that fun? All right, here we go. George, I wish you'd look at the nursery. What's wrong with it? I don't know. Well then, I just want you to look at it is all, or call a psychologist in to look at it. What would a psychologist want with a nursery? You know very well what he'd want. His wife paused in the middle of the kitchen and watched the stove busy humming to itself, making supper for 4. It's just that the nursery is different now than it was. All right, let's have a look. They walked down the hall of their soundproof Happy Life home, which had cost them $30,000 installed. This house, which clothed and fed and rocked them to sleep and played and sang and was good to them. Their approach sensitized a switch somewhere, and the nursery light flicked on when they came within 10 feet of it. Similarly, behind them, in the halls, lights went on and off as they left them behind, with a soft automaticity. Well, said George Hadley, they stood on the thatched floor of the nursery. It was 40 feet across by 40 feet long and 30 feet high. It had cost half again as much as the rest of the house. But nothing's too good for our children, George had said. The nursery was silent. It was as empty as a jungle glade at hot high noon. The walls were blank and two-dimensional. Now, as George and Lydia Hadley stood in the center of the room, The walls began to purr and recede into crystalline distance, it seemed, and presently an African veldt appeared, in 3 dimensions, on all sides, in colors reproduced to the final pebble and bit of straw. The ceiling above them became a deep sky with a hot yellow sun. All right, so this story is clearly very different from Asimov's. We have a sparse section of dialogue that introduces the conceit of the story. There is a problem in the nursery. The characters are clearly parents, they are concerned for their child. The big difference is the jungle lush, get it? The jungle lush language that Bradbury uses. While there is certainly a what if and a compelling story, Bradbury uses poetic language to add atmosphere. He's going for a little more depth than Asimov did. Chapter 5 of The Legacy of the Iron Dragon finds the Admiral speaking with the director of the Geneva Planetary Evacuation Authority. The Chota-An pose a threat to humanity, so we built seed ships, generation ships that just zoom off into space for decades as the crew reproduces, ages, is replaced, and dies. This is hard science fiction, so there's more of a focus on scientific accuracy. If the point of your story is to illustrate how stomping a butterfly 70 million years ago can change the future, there probably isn't a ton of math involved. But if your story is partly about filling ships with enough people who can staff a ship and reproduce, and eventually find a habitable planet far from an alien threat, that's different. We're curious about the math. Look how Mr. Kroese does the math. Like Asimov, his dialogue often goes without many dialogue tags. You know, those things that, hey, Sally said, taking a bite of her cheesecake. Here's a section in which the characters are discussing, and educating the audience, about the seed ships. Yes, the idea is that a few generations after the colonists reach their destination, they have the resources to set up a fertility clinic. Women can be artificially inseminated, and embryos can be implanted in surrogate mothers. But here's the thing, there's no reason the clinic can't be set up on the seed ship while it is traveling. If you did that, you wouldn't need the full 400 colonists. You'd create your own colonists on your way to the destination. How many initial colonists would you need in that scenario? 15, said the director, maybe fewer. But they'd have to be all female, healthy, and between 14 and 25 years old, and you'd still need the cryogenic payload, medical personnel, and facilities for implanting embryos. Otherwise, you'd run into problems with inbreeding within a few generations. Then why the hell did we build ships big enough for 400 people? The Seed Ship Project was concerned with more than simply perpetuating the species. Ideally, we would preserve something of human culture and technology as well. That's a lot easier to do with 400 people than 20. Those issues aside, assuming access to the TGP and medical resources, humanity could theoretically be sustained indefinitely? Yes, assuming 1 pregnancy per year for 20 years multiplied by 15 women, all from unrelated implanted embryos, you'd have a population of 300 unrelated individuals in a single generation. That alone would likely be sufficient genetic diversity to keep the race going. If you utilized implanted embryos for another generation, you'd have several thousand unrelated individuals, far more than you could fit comfortably on a seed ship. Phew! Look, I have an MFA, okay? Look, I swear, the last math class I took to satisfy the requirement, it was shapes. I literally took shapes in college. Computer, play Ancient Earth media that reflects how the section made me feel.
Now, at the present rate of taxation on GNP of 39%, doesn't this come to about the same $60 billion in increased revenue?
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
All right, I'm kidding. I like this kind of thought. It adds verisimilitude, the appearance of reality in fiction. And as a longtime nerd, it's fun to debate whether or not Mr. Kroese's plan would work. You really haven't lived until you and a friend have challenged each other to try and beat the Kobayashi Maru in their bedroom. The math in this section is used in a felicitous manner. The sparse dialogue also makes it easy for the reader to follow along and evaluate the plan. What's the lesson here? If you're introducing a complicated concept, do so in a very simple manner. And you can also reverse this concept. A romance story is the simplest around. 2 people love each other and must end up together. How does this happen? Well, it's complicated. All right, come on, give me a break. I've been locked alone in a room for 10 months, not conducive to comic timing. Every tool in our toolbox must be used in a manner that serves the story. Right now, I'm talking about sentences. In the olden days, you could watch an episode of All in the Family. Well, I suppose you still can. But the point is that in many cases, the first act of the show would take place in only one location and in real time. Adhering to the Aristotelian unities. Today, it's cut. Scenes fly by before you have a chance to understand what is happening. And don't get me started on contemporary action movies. Not only are there 12 zillion cuts a minute, but the camera was seemingly on a paint shaker instead of a gimbal. The point is that each element of storytelling must be contrived to serve our story. How does this relate to sentences? Long sentences, long scenes. They're not always better. This, of course, is the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. On June 6, 1944, thousands of heroes leapt from transports as German machine guns bared down on them. These shots in the movie must be short. The camera must be shaky. I should have a little bit of trouble understanding what's going on. This is exactly how it felt on that all-important day. Check out this battle scene from The Legacy of the Iron Dragon. Thus, although Godcom was almost 2,000 kilometers from the Chota-An wedge as it entered orbit, Huiskamp had a perfect view of the ships from a satellite 60 kilometers below them. An algorithm-generated view showed the IDL ships creeping up behind. Huiskamp had given a general order to fire at will as soon as the enemy was in range, and the IDL ships began their attack, first with missiles, and then with railguns. Godcom was too far away to use its railguns, but it added its own volley of missiles to the assault. The vibration of the launching rockets could be felt through the floor of the command deck. Minute glimmers, like overbright stars, appeared momentarily on the horizon as missiles detonated against Chota-An countermeasures. Farther up, defense satellites began to fire as well. The soundless explosions grew slowly brighter and more numerous as more ships came into range. The Chota-An, apparently saving their ammunition for the sea ships, did not return fire. The great black ship slipped around the curve of the planet, one of the destroyers so close that Huiskamp could see it with his naked eye. It was a chaotic and not very effective attack, but a destroyer and 3 interceptors were torn apart within the first few minutes of fighting. As he'd hoped, the Chota-An were only employing railguns to minimal effect so far. A few IDL ships had been struck, but none had been seriously damaged. The fast-moving wedge began to slip out of the effective range of the IDL ships. All right, Mr. Kroese is smart enough to vary the sentences so they don't get boring, but see how there's a punchy rhythm? A ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, right? This is a good principle to employ when writing battle scenes or other kinds of scenes that should be fast-paced. In this way, we can contrive our prose to mimic the events we're describing. In a romance scene, you want those things to be calm, to draw things out, at least at the beginning, right? So maybe you use longer and more florid sentences. Then, toward the end of, things, maybe short and clipped is more appropriate. Okay, maybe clipped is the wrong word, but you get the idea. The goal of a battle scene, of course, is to allow the reader to imagine what is happening in the vacuum of space. Mr. Kroese doesn't mess around and keeps the sentences short and sweet. Please check out this book. I've left a link in the description. All of the links are there. Mr. Kroese is a really interesting person, and you should check out his stuff. And I am going to take a page from Mr. Kroese's book and do some modest self-promotion. You won't get anything in life unless you ask, right? Instead of making my own stuff an afterthought, as I usually do, I will invite you cordially to check out the world's first guy-friendly romance. TM. In ignoring that she thinks she's a witch, Bryce is an actuary. He loves numbers and facts. He thinks Julie is a good match. She's hot, she's financially dependent, and she's an attorney. She literally went to school for 3 years to learn how to think logically. It's all good until he finally realizes, she thinks she's a witch. Will Bryce be able to get over his silly hang-up before it's too late? I know I've never harmed a relationship for stupid reasons, right? I know you haven't either. But it's fun to read about a guy who is dumb enough to make that mistake. Links in the description. I should also be less shy about asking you to like this video and to subscribe so you'll see all of my uploads. And now I'll ask you some questions to subconsciously nudge you into leaving a comment, which will also improve my analytics and make my videos more favorable to the algorithm. Look at the first paragraph of your own work in progress. Maybe you share it. Does it epitomize the tone of your work as a whole? Who are some writers who give us great introductions? How do you approach doing the math for your readers? I'm Kenneth Nichols, also known as Allison Rhodes, reminding you that books are good.